Welcome to the Scaling Japan podcast, a podcast about how to grow your business from $100,000 and beyond in the land of the rising sun.
Welcome to the Scaling Japan podcast. I am your host, Tyson Batino, and on today's episode, we have Andrew Edsall. He is the CEO and head researcher for Great Wave Consulting and the APAC Director of Response AI. He will help us understand what market research is and how it is a key step before launching a new business or expanding a current business to Japan. I'm really excited to get an in-depth look from someone who has many years of experience in this field. Andrew, it's so great to have you. And could you please give a quick self-introduction?
Sure. Thanks, Tyson. So I'm originally from the US, and when I was growing up, I was fascinated with Japan. It was the late 80s, it was the bubble, and I felt drawn to Japan. And when I was in high school, I had the opportunity to do a one-year homestay program in Tokyo, and it changed my life. So I ended up studying Japanese and business in college and moved back in 2002, and I've been here in Tokyo ever since. And my path into market research wasn't maybe necessarily what you would call your typical agency or marketing agency, but it was more what I would consider applied research. So one job I was working as a translator in a museum, and I noticed that all of the work that I was doing wasn't really being appreciated by the visitors to the museum. And so I ended up doing a research project to understand a little bit more about the visitors, and that led to a project where instead of going too deep about Japanese history and culture, I just said, let's just provide enough information so that people are interested. And that was very successful. Later on, I ended up spending about almost 10 years in consulting and working with companies and individuals to help them understand how can they make different moves in their career. And in many ways, headhunting is just one long, in-depth interview process. You have to understand your clients and their needs. You also have to understand your candidates and their needs. I moved from recruiting into market research about 6, 7 years ago.
Cool. So yeah, I think you brought up a really important point of, I guess, really knowing your customer and knowing what they want, and failure to do that can have a big impact on the business. And another reason I really wanted to get you on there is I think a lot of us, we have an idea of what market research is, but I don't think that everyone really knows how deep it goes. And, you're a buddy of mine. We've spoken a lot, and I'm always impressed. Like, how can you go that deep? Or like, wow, you know so much about that one topic. And it always impresses me. And I hope to learn more about market research myself. I'll start off with a general question is, why is it important to do market research?
I think the simple answer would be you wouldn't get in your car and just go down the road without knowing where you're going to go. And if you're having a longer trip or bringing a new product, if you're planning a vacation, you would plan, where are we going to stay? What restaurants do you want to go to? What kind of attractions or what's interesting to you? You would do your research. And if you're in a company or in a business and you're bringing a product or service to Japan, that usually represents a massive investment. And if you're going to be spending, hundreds of thousands, if not millions or even billions of dollars, like some of my clients, then you want to make sure, I always say a little bit of research goes a long way because it can help you to understand what your plan should look like or what your service should look like.
Yeah, with good market research or just understanding the situation that you're getting into. But it's like for every time you spend on research, you would actually spend maybe like 5 times fixing it or like 10 times more fixing the issue.
Yes, and oftentimes Japan is not maybe necessarily a very forgiving towards failure, and so you might try to spend that money to fix it, but it might be too late.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of cases about that. But yeah, so I think that's a very interesting way to put it. Could you also share like some more specific ways that market research can help a company?
Sure. So some examples that come to mind are validating business ideas, identifying key customer segments, and gaining insights for authentic and effective messaging. A couple years ago, I was involved with a project for a Japanese company in the healthcare space, and they were considering a change in one of their business units that would have required massive restructuring. And the fundamental question is, would changing the way that the company is structured and the way that it operates, would it be profitable? And after doing desk research, so looking at existing reports and understanding the client's positioning in the market, and then also doing a survey of medical professionals, the information that we gathered, we were able to provide to the client, and ultimately they decided that it did not make financial sense to change their business model. And so in that sense, they're trying to solve a problem. Going and changing that structure would have probably cost them a lot more.
Cool that you're able to help that company that way, because I know there's been some historically interesting cases, like I think it was the diapers, maybe I think it might have been Pampers, where they actually had commercials where they used the stork, like the bird. But in Japan, they actually have no culture of birds being related to babies. It didn't really connect with people, and just, a bit of market research looking into like, does the bird concept actually transfer to Japan, would have saved them a lot of advertising money and also money in, having to re-educate customers, which could have been solved from day one.
So much of marketing today seems to be very focused on, developing a concept and A/B testing and showing a consumer, here's version A and here's version B. But those are making certain assumptions. And if you don't do your research and you present, here's stork A and here's stork B, but your customers don't even understand the concept of the stork, then you've missed the point completely. And so that's where having the research and saying, maybe you're having a sit down with a group of mothers, or you're having a sit down with one mother or several individuals. And some people might say, oh, well, I might think of Momotaro, or I might think of the hospital, or I might think of being held in my mother's arms, or whatever that moment, but it's probably not going to be, oh, we were dropped off by a bird, right? So if you don't do that, then where your starting point is fundamentally different. I reached out to the Japan marketing manager for a company one day, and a few hours later received an inquiry from their office, which was for their research office, which was actually outside Japan. And they wanted to bring their service and develop, and they were so used to how their service was used in other markets. So we had to do a lot of work to get to the client to the point where they did understand what is the standard and what is the market like in Japan. And then they can consider, how do we need to adjust and adapt their product?
I think that's a really amazing point that, for market research, I think one of the key benefits it brings is to confirm if the strategies that have worked in, let's say, America and Europe, will it actually transfer to Japan before you start? And sometimes using that as a basis.
At a previous firm, they did a project, and it was related to home cleaning. And the maker is saying, oh, you can use it on everything. You can use it on the floor. You can use it on the dishes. You can use it on the bath. You can use it on the toilet. And my colleagues were aghast because, well, here we use different mops and different like what you use for the floor or the toilet, you don't use for your dishes. So I don't care what your marketing says, but that's not going to fly here. So that would
No,
have been a big faux pas.
yeah, no, I think that's a good example. And I forgot what American company it was, but it was kind of like, because Japan doesn't have ovens, and let's say they wanted to sell their baking products, they came up with the concept of, or let's create a product that you can cook in your rice cooker. Maybe if they've interviewed more people, they would have figured out that actually, rice is very important in Japan. It's very sacred. Like my wife, like if I leave some rice left over, she's like, you can't do that. It's like sacred to her. But they didn't want to contaminate the rice cooker
Mm,
with something sweet or like baking products. A little bit of research
yeah.
goes a long way. I think some other areas you mentioned that market research could help is like, really understanding your existing customers in Japan, but also potential new customers for your product that you didn't think about because it's a different market, developing new and effective strategies for the Japan market. Key one, I think, is setting realistic targets for your business. I think in my interview with Mao Schwartz and even a couple of the other ones, I think one of the biggest issues that foreign companies have with their market entry to Japan is sometimes they expect everything to be done in like 6 months, or let's get it all done in 1 year. But sometimes it actually takes 3 years, 5 years. But I wanted to ask you, like, based on your experience, like, so how could market research actually help educate some foreign companies about setting more realistic targets for their market entry?
That can be a complex question to answer, but I did a project a while back. The client had been in the market for a few years and had made some partnerships, but wasn't necessarily seeing a huge jump. And after surveying the market and doing surveys and also speaking with business owners and potential users of this company's service, I said, well, in your ecosystem, you are connected with service A, B, C, and D, and most of these aren't even covered in Japan. If you want to understand how to be effective, one way is to connect with companies M, N, and O, which are based here. And I checked their site last year, and they had actually established a new business partnership with one of those additional services, and I hope it's having an impact. The other thing for that company is they were very focused on servicing the domestic market. In that company's case, I said, you actually have a very valuable resource, which is your interconnected and international system. And there would be a huge opportunity where you could connect Japanese users with the market outside of Japan. And so if you could provide that and use that, there might actually be more of a market because Japanese like pop culture items, things like manga and anime and figures and whatnot, they're very popular overseas. They're popular here too, but the overall market is much larger overseas.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Scaling Japan. In addition to serving as your fine host, I also provide advisory and coaching services to business owners who want to 2x, 5x, and even 10x their business. So stop holding your company and your team and your employees back, and let me help you and your company scale. Find more information at scalingyourcompany.com. Now back to the episode. Yeah, I think that actually brings up an interesting point that one market entry strategy is maybe partner with Japanese companies who are outside of Japan, and that would actually make your entry to Japan much easier because you have those types of examples. We've been talking a lot about kind of some mistakes, but what are some potential issues that could kill your business before you even launch it in Japan?
Oh, there's so many. For example, if it's a food, think about things like ingredients or flavor or things like seasonality play a big role in Japanese society. So if you have a product that is not changing often enough, and so just because you're selling like hotcakes right now might not necessarily mean it was going to be popular the following year. I can think of the boba tea boom of 2019, I think it was. And I actually predicted that lemonade would be next, and it happened.
I know there's a couple lemonade change that happened, I think just after the boba tea.
Mm-hmm. But of course, COVID has changed a lot of different behaviors. So understanding how does COVID affect, for example, mask wearing, or how does COVID affect travel? Or how does the exchange rate, if you are a tourist destination in the United States, right now with the yen almost 150 to the dollar, are you going to have the same amount of tourists? What kind of decisions are people making based on these kinds of factors? That is where something like a survey, which I work with Response AI to do, can be done, and it's very quick, and you can have that actionable data in hand very quickly.
Gotcha. You mentioned, I think, in the intro, regulation as well. And I think in our interview with Timothy, he shared one example as well. Like, I think in Japan, they have like an approved list of ingredients versus, I believe in other countries, sometimes you can kind of get away with it. As long as it's not disapproved, you can kind of use it. But in Japan, they have the opposite approach, which is an approved list, and it has to be on that list. Have you heard of other cases like potential regulation that could pretty much kill a business or stop it in its tracks?
For example, medicine, pharmaceuticals. So I've received many requests over the years for companies that are interested in looking at, like, say, like the insurance market. And they have requests for like payer and payee, and they're not necessarily always familiar with the idea of the national health insurance. And the government has a list. It's about 200 pages of, you can download the list of all the medicine that is approved in Japan and what the government is approved for those charges. So there might be a cancer treatment that is going to cost $200,000 or more in the US for a year's supply, but it might be sold here for the equivalent of $50,000. It's still a lot of money, but
Gotcha. No, that's a very useful point. Yeah, that's interesting. So I guess my next question would be, what are some of the possible questions that you would answer for your clients when you do market research on their behalf?
every project is a little bit different, but just some examples are, I've done some projects related to geopolitical situations. So as relationships between countries and markets and certain areas change, does that impact the decisions of businesses that have people and resources or have customers? Do some of those changes impact those decisions? Other examples would be a new medical or cosmetic product, and what is the market size of this? I did a project recently related to software as a service, and I spoke with small and medium-sized businesses that were the users of it, and I also spoke with that might use that same system, but were actually often familiar with other systems. And so just understanding like which one is easier to use from this perspective or which is easier to use from this perspective. And there were some things that were differentiating between the different groups. What areas need to be focused on really depends on the project. Clients are facing a question or an opportunity or a problem. And so my goal is to help them go through a structured process to help answer those questions. And also, if the opportunity arises, maybe delve a little bit deeper and find some of the deeper kind of hidden causes that might not necessarily occur naturally. So for example, if a company is bringing a new product to market, is there a need for this? When would someone use this? What's the cost? What kind of features? Is there an educational opportunity? Is it replacing something, or do they need to learn, or is there some confusion? What is the market size? It's one thing to just look at Japan's population and say, oh, there's 126 million people. Our target demographic is this age group, and we think there's this many. But because of Japan's upside down demographic pyramid, that market might not be so big. How should it be sold? Is it something that is better sold in a store? Or is it something that can be sold online? How do you reach those consumers? What are the best sales channels? What are some of the barriers? Sometimes being a new product can be a good thing, but it can also be a hindrance as well. And how does that compare to the local competition? Looking at all of that, and then also considering some of the different unique business models or the value chain and how some of the key differentiators. A few minutes ago, you mentioned the example of ovens. Well, Japan, we don't have Thanksgiving here, but we do have Christmas. And we don't have turkey at Christmas. People tend to eat Kentucky Fried Chicken. When you think of that, you realize that the company that runs KFC Japan, if my memory is correct, I believe it's all vertically integrated. So they have the access to they run the chicken farms, they run the poultry processing plants, they have the logistics to get the food products to the restaurants. They have the management of the restaurants. They can run the operational systems through like their IT subsidiaries. And so it's all connected and part of that group. And so understanding that that's how it works is really important. Also understanding how Japan might be different. So for example, in companies in Europe and the US, you're more likely to have maybe an IT team or like a development team internally. Whereas in Japan, IT talent has tended to be working for a company that just specializes in IT services. And so that lack of internal IT staff has tended to prevent some innovation.
Yeah, and that's the interesting point about the IT. I think in my upcoming interview with John, who you introduced, and my chat with Fuminori as well, I think one topic was when you sell tech products, sometimes the Japanese company, they will ask you to talk with their IT vendor because that's where all the IT knowledge for their company, it's actually with a third-party company, and in some cases rely on their opinion to introduce your product to them. And for KFC, like, yeah, I thought it was interesting because I think McDonald's, maybe the price has changed, but like, a set meal might still be around 500 yen. But I went to KFC yesterday and ended up spending like, I think 700 yen with the KFC. Like when I was just looking all over, it's like, everything is from Japan. They really tried to position themselves as a local company in a way.
Mm-hmm.
I think they've done that very strategically. So yeah, I think next I'd like to move on to, so we've heard about how market research can prevent us from making big mistakes. Some of the areas that you would research in advance to help us, like, what is the market size? Should you sell your existing product or do you have to change that product for the Japanese market? What are the best sales channels? How does it compare to local products? What is the competition or who are your competitors, partners? And just, like business model, value chain, and a lot of other things. But could you actually help us understand, like, what is the market research process?
There tend to be three parts. There's your initial, once a project is commissioned, there would be like your project setup, which might include if you're doing, say, consumer expert interviews or a focus group of consumers, that would be recruiting. So finding people that meet certain criteria. The second step would be your field work, which is the act of interviewing or having maybe someone do a survey. And then the last part would be your reporting and analysis. And so within each of those things, there are a lot of moving parts that need to come together. So for example, if you're going to have a home visit interview, maybe the client is going to go with you to a customer's house. I was involved with a project a few years back, and we went to the house, and it was extremely small, and it was a mother and father, and they're in their extremely tiny house. Their son had a fever, and partway through the interview, their son got sick, and the mom was a champ. She just cleaned it up and continued the interview. And the clients were shocked, but we finished, and it required a lot of bringing everything together. So how do you get to that home, having translators to give simultaneous translation in English for the clients, etc.
I think one thing I learned talking to, but it's something that we learn in university as well, though, like, quantitative versus qualitative research. But could you tell us what they are and I guess what the differences are?
Qualitative tends to focus more on like your feelings and emotions and then pulling insights out of that. Whereas quantitative is looking more at numbers. And so your results is more a number or numeric probability. So in that case, you're doing a survey and that would have a larger audience. So just to give an example, if I'm going to be doing like an in-depth interview, which is just like a one-on-one conversation with someone. It might be an hour or an hour and a half, and it would be asking questions and hearing their answers and then delving deeper into that. One isn't enough, minimum of 3 per group, but oftentimes it might be 5 or 7 or up to 10. It really depends on what the client is looking for or budget. From that dialogue is also a chance for the respondent to say, oh, I really wish this product did this. I love it when this happens, or I wish I had this. And those are ideas that don't come from a survey. I was having an in-depth interview with an expert a few years ago, and someone said, I don't know if I should say this, but, and said that they did something which isn't necessarily frowned on in other countries overseas, but it happened, and they admitted to it. So that kind of information doesn't come from a survey. Now, when you're doing a survey, you're looking at a larger group. So, for example, it might be 600 people total, half men, half women, a third in their 20s, a third in their 30s, a third in their 40s. And then you're able to look at, well, we have 600 total, and these are the numbers. And then you're able to see, where is that key difference? Is there a difference between age, or is there a difference between gender, or is there a correlation between maybe income or level of education or career? So that's where you can see kind of like a bigger trend. And then that is also useful for example saying, what is a good price? Like if you're going to be pricing something, if you price it too low, you're going to leave money on the table. If you price it too high, then you're not going to sell. It's going to be prohibitively expensive. So that's where a survey can help you understand like what's maybe that key pricing, or is this appealing, and get the numbers for that.
Thanks for explaining the process of how you would do the research for qualitative versus quantitative. And yeah, I guess that makes sense for the qualitative aspect, that you can definitely get some insights that you wouldn't get simply from a survey, and especially something that's really specific to Japan, that you need someone just listening intently and getting the information out. I have a pretty good idea now, thanks to your explanation. I guess if I was a company looking to do research, and maybe especially for the first time where I want to do it well, what type of situations would you recommend, like quantitative versus qualitative?
So there is a process and there isn't preferred order, and it really depends on like how much information does the client have. And then based on that, I can make a better recommendation. So if the prospective client already has a lot of data and knowledge about Japan, then maybe a survey is enough. If they are trying to understand the greater market overall, it might require some desk research as well as interviews, as well as a survey, and possibly some other research techniques as well.
That was very useful. So I guess the more data that we have, you can adjust based on that.
I was working on a research pitch, had a meeting with one of the end client's CFOs, and also a consulting firm that we were working with. And we were having this debate, and I was recommending first do qualitative to get the insights from consumers, and then do the quantitative, which would be the survey. And the consulting partner said, we've done this in a million different markets. Let's just do the quantitative first. When they received the results of the survey, they basically realized that they didn't know enough to really answer and really anchor the responses to something that was really valuable. So in that sense, they would either end up doing it again after.
Have you ever found yourself having trouble creating a business plan? Do you pretty much operate on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis, creating confusion and chaos in your organization? If that sounds like you, I recommend you join my Entrepreneur Bootcamp. In my bootcamp, you'll set an achievable but challenging revenue target for the current or following fiscal year, and we will create a business plan to make it a reality. See more in the show notes below. And now back to our episode. Thanks for sharing that. And I think that actually ties into my next question. What information can companies provide upfront that would help you as a market researcher better serve them?
Yeah, so every project starts with a brief. It might be, hey, we want to sell this product. Is there a market or how can we do this? I worked on a project a while back and there is a product in Japan. Sales were doing well for many years, and recently sales have declined precipitously. And so they wanted to understand what is the reason? Is it a change of consumer preference or consumer habits? Is it a change of the retail channels and how it's sold? If the client is not receiving visits from the distributor salesperson on a regular basis, do they not have enough information to recommend this product, or is there some confusion about the product and how it's different from other products on the market that they might be more familiar with? It can be, there are some projects where everything is very clear from the beginning, which is helpful. And then there are other projects where it might start with just that question. We use that question to probe deeper.
Gotcha. Is there anything else? So the target audience for this question would be companies who've used market researchers in the past, but like based on your experience, what they could have done better to help you get them the results they wanted.
Communication is really important. I can think of a project I did a while back where I was working with another firm. There wasn't a clear channel between the end client and their expectations and understanding what they knew and didn't know about the market in the beginning. And so the next time I'm in that situation, I would work with my partner to streamline that process and streamline that communication.
And yeah, I think that point you mentioned about communication is so important among the end client. I heard this example from another friend in a private discussion, but I think one case, the company that they're working with, they didn't have good communication between, I think, the product team and the team doing, like, let's say, that was in charge of the Japan market entry, like working with the research firm. Because there are communication issues, and even from on top, like to the Japan market team, they pretty much had to spend double the amount of money on market research because of
Mm.
changes.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, actually, we want to focus more on this product instead. When you're doing things at a high level of potential return, but also, let's say, a lot of risk, precision is so important.
I had a friend who, in their industry, they had a contract with the manufacturer, and based on the contract that they had in place with their client, they had to purchase a very large amount of some very expensive material. So according to their contract, they kept their end of the bargain. And when they let the client know that they had procured that amount of material, the client said, "We can't take this right now." Every day that they had that material cost them tens of thousands of dollars just in holding costs.
Wow. Cool. Thank you so much for sharing with us your thoughts on market research. And, it was like also helping us, like, if we were to utilize market research in the future, how to better go about it. Yeah. So I guess just about yourself, though, like, are there any areas of market research that you specialize in, or how do you help your clients?
In the words of Liam Neeson, I would have to say I possess a certain unique set of skills. For me, what's important is understanding the problems or understanding the opportunities, and also finding several different options to help my client achieve their goals. And that's also where communication with the client is key.
I mean, I know you well. We've been buddies for a long time. And what always impresses me is, let's say, you think there's 15 ways, but after you talk to Andrew, like, there's actually 50, 100 of 150 ways. It's like the question that I often get is like, where the hell do you have all this time to learn this much about a subject? I'm in the education space, and we sometimes talk about like the education. I help answer some of your questions, but like, wow, this guy really goes deep. So I think it's kind of a unique thing about your personality as well, and like a brain type that just allows you to go so deep and see all these different angles, like an archaeologist in a way. thoroughly looking at all the different angles. So yeah, anyone out there who has a, let's say, pretty decent sized project and you want to go deep and you don't want to make a mistake and want to be very thorough, I think Andrew is really, really good for that. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Tyson.